Welcome to tonight's sleep story. Tonight, I invite you to travel through time, not through hours or days, but across the vast and winding river of human history. A journey that begins long before skyscrapers or empires, before flags, borders, or even language as we know it. It begins with firelight flickering on cave walls, and ends in a world humming with digital code. This is the entire story of us, of humankind, told from the very beginning, all the way to today. You'll hear of ancient migrations across grasslands and frozen tundra, of the first seeds sown in soft riverbed soil, and of the great cities that rose and fell beneath the sun. You'll hear of pharaohs and philosophers, of silk roads and sailing ships, of ideas that sparked revolutions and machines that reshaped the world. This story is not just one of progress, but of resilience, of people dreaming, building, loving, and learning in every age, under every sky. Before we begin, I'd love it if you could take a moment to comment where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet kind of wonder to see how this little corner of the internet becomes a place where people from every continent gather to rest, to learn, and to dream together. Now make yourself comfortable. Put your phone on Do Not Disturb. Adjust your pillows. Let your body settle into softness. There is nothing else you need to do. The story will unfold gently around you. You don't need to catch every detail. It's enough simply to listen, to let your imagination carry you through stone circles and pyramids, across deserts and oceans, into candlelit monasteries and the glowing cities of the modern age. This is a story of hunters and poets, kings and weavers, soldiers, scientists, prophets, and peasants. It is the story of how we got here, and how, through all things, we kept going. So, when you're ready, we'll begin. This is the entire story of human history, from the Stone Age to today, the dawn of humanity. Long before the first cities, before writing or stone temples or the concept of kings, there was only the land, vast, untamed, and silent except for the rhythms of wind, water, and the occasional rustle of creatures moving unseen through the grass. It was into this world, over 300,000 years ago, that the first anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, appeared in the heart of Africa. They were not alone in the world. Other human species had come before, Homo habilis, who shaped the earliest tools from stone, Homo erectus, who harnessed fire and spread across Asia, and Neanderthals, our distant cousins who hunted mammoths and huddled in caves beneath cold European skies. But Homo sapiens were different. Their bodies were agile, their minds more flexible. They possessed a capacity not only for survival, but for imagination. They began in small, nomadic bands, never staying long in one place. They followed the migrations of animals, the seasons of fruit-bearing trees, the shifting patterns of rain. Their world was a moving tapestry of survival, of listening to the earth and adapting to it. They slept beneath the stars or in the shelter of cliffs and trees, their nights lit by flickering firelight. Every dawn, they woke to the smell of wood smoke and dew, to the calls of birds and the crunch of footfalls in the underbrush. In their hands, they held tools chipped from flint, spears, scrapers, awls. Their fingers were calloused from work, their eyes sharp from watching the horizon. And their minds, slowly but steadily, were becoming something new. We know this not just from bones, but from echoes left behind, red ochre smeared onto stone walls, handprints pressed into cave ceilings like signatures, carved figurines of women with rounded hips, fertility symbols, perhaps, or simply glimpses of what was meaningful to them. These were the first signs of symbolic thought, of expression beyond survival. By 100,000 years ago, they had begun to bury their dead, not just leave them behind, but placed them into the earth with care, sometimes with tools, shells, pigments. The act suggests reverence, grief, possibly even belief in something beyond. Their world was dangerous, unpredictable, and wild, yet rich. Herds of antelope and wildebeest thundered across open plains. Rivers teemed with fish. Forests offered roots, nuts, and fruits. They learned to hunt in silence, to track animals through broken twigs and subtle footprints. They learned to store knowledge, not in books, but in memory and in story. Around fires at night, they passed on what they had seen, where the buffalo moved, which plants to chew for pain, where the leopard's den lay hidden in the hills. This oral tradition, born in the deep dark of ancient nights, was our first library. From Africa, over thousands of years, they began to move. They followed river valleys and coastlines, drawn by food, by curiosity, or perhaps simply by the age-old instinct to roam. Generation by generation, over vast stretches of time, small groups drifted outward, across the Sinai into the Middle East, then fanning out into Europe, into Central and South Asia, across the steppes and tundra. By around 60,000 years ago, they had reached the shores of India. Soon after, some crossed open sea, likely on simple rafts or dugout canoes, and made their way into Southeast Asia and Australia. It was one of humanity's first great voyages across water. They entered a continent full of strange, giant creatures, wombats the size of cars, towering flightless birds, marsupial lions. Over time, these great animals vanished, and the people adapted to the new rhythms of the land. In Europe, they encountered the Neanderthals. There, in icy forests and windswept valleys, the two human species lived side by side, and sometimes together. They interbred. Their DNA remains in us still, carried quietly through generations. As the Ice Age deepened, glaciers crept across northern lands. Sea levels fell, exposing land bridges. The world was colder, harsher. But still, humans endured. They developed more refined tools, barbed harpoons, bone needles for stitching hides into warm clothing, lamps filled with animal fat to light their shelters. They carved flutes from bird bones, perhaps the first music to echo through empty caves. In southern France and northern Spain, they painted on walls, majestic bulls, leaping deer, mysterious handprints, in ochre, charcoal, and earth. These cave paintings, dating back 30,000 years or more, are among the earliest known forms of art. Some believe they were spiritual, others ritualistic, or even part of early storytelling. In time, humans reached Siberia, then crossed a frozen land bridge called Beringia into the Americas. The first people of the Americas likely arrived over 15,000 years ago, maybe earlier, walking through ice-free corridors or traveling by boat along the coast. They spread swiftly, settling from Alaska to Patagonia. In forests, plains, and deserts, they hunted giant sloths and mammoths, learned to cultivate wild plants, and formed their own cultures in isolation from the old world. With each migration, humanity changed, not just physically, but culturally. They adapted their languages, tools, beliefs, and customs to each new environment. In the Arctic, they built homes from snow. In the rainforest, they climbed trees for fruit and hunted with blow darts. In deserts, they learned to find water hidden beneath dry sand. And everywhere they formed bonds, families, tribes, communities. They shared food, raised children, mourned the dead. They watched the stars and gave them names. They wondered where storms came from, or why the sun returned each morning. Slowly, their minds filled with myths and meaning. The hunter-gatherer life was one of motion and intimacy with nature. These early people knew their lands with a depth difficult to imagine today. The migration patterns of birds, the healing properties of bark, the shape of tracks left behind by foxes or deer. They lived lightly, but not primitively. Their knowledge was vast. Their days were shaped by survival, yes, but also by ritual, by language, by community. Their world was not divided by nations or flags, but by rivers, mountains, seasons, and memory. For tens of thousands of years, this way of life sustained humanity. Then, slowly, a quiet revolution began to stir. It didn't start with battles or great monuments, but with seeds. Perhaps it was an accident. A stalk of wild grain dropped near a shelter, later found growing the next season. Or maybe it was deliberate, someone watching how plants grew, learning to scatter seeds by hand. In the fertile river valleys of what we now call the Middle East, something began to change. Humans, for the first time, stopped roaming. They stayed. But that chapter, the beginning of agriculture, is still to come. For now, in this dawn of our story, we find ourselves still in the deep past. A world lit by fire and starlight, where wolves howled beyond the tree line, and the first humans sang songs no one remembers, but which once echoed across the vast and sleeping earth. The agricultural revolution. It began quietly, not with trumpets or banners, but with observation, with the soft fall of seeds into soil, and the slow realization that life could be coaxed from the earth in place, season after season. Somewhere, perhaps along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what we now call the Fertile Crescent, a crescent-shaped swath of land stretching through parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Turkey. Early humans began to notice a pattern. When they left seeds behind, sometimes plants grew, and when they returned to the same place, food was easier to find. These early experiments with sowing and harvesting may have seemed modest at first, almost accidental, but they would reshape the destiny of our species. The agricultural revolution, as it would come to be known, was not a single event. It did not unfold overnight, nor in just one place. Instead, it emerged independently in multiple regions across the globe. In Mesopotamia, yes, but also in the Nile Valley, the Indus River Basin, the Yellow and Yangtze rivers of China, the highlands of Mesoamerica, and the forests of West Africa. Each of these societies domesticated their own unique plants and animals. In the Middle East, it was wheat and barley. In China, millet and rice. In Central America, maize or corn, along with beans and squash. In the Andes, people learned to cultivate potatoes and quinoa. In Africa, it was sorghum and yams. The tools were simple: sharpened sticks, stone hoes, woven baskets. But the implications were profound. As the Earth warmed at the end of the last ice age, around 11,100 years ago, conditions became ripe for this shift. Glaciers retreated, grasslands flourished, rivers swelled. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, the climate stabilized, and with it, the foundation for settlement was laid. With farming came permanence. No longer needing to follow the herds, some human groups began to build more enduring homes. They cleared fields, constructed storage pits, and learned to build with mud brick and timber. Small villages formed, clusters of dwellings, often circular or rectangular, arranged near water sources or along fertile plains. In what is now southeastern Turkey, a remarkable site tells the story of this shift. Göbekli Tepe, a temple complex over 11,000 years old, predates the pyramids by more than 6 millennia. Its towering stone pillars, carved with images of lions, vultures, and scorpions, suggest not only the birth of settled life, but the emergence of shared belief and ritual. Remarkably, this sacred place was built not by city dwellers, but likely by early agriculturalists still transitioning from hunting and gathering. It reminds us that community, spirituality, and architecture were intertwined even in these first steps towards civilization. Farming brought with it both abundance and complexity. A single field of wheat could feed many more people than foraging alone. With more food came population growth. With growth came division of labor. Not everyone needed to hunt or gather anymore. Some became potters. Others built tools. Still others watched the skies, marking the turning of the seasons to predict when to sow and when to reap. These were the first calendars, carved into bone, etched into stone, and later inked onto parchment. The rhythms of nature became tied to the rhythms of human life. And yet, for all its advantages, agriculture also brought new challenges. Settled life meant staying close to waste, animals, and other people, leading to the rise of disease in ways never seen before. Tooth decay, malnutrition, and infection became more common in farming societies than in their hunter-gatherer ancestors. The diet, once varied with fruits, nuts, and meats, narrowed. Many early farmers relied heavily on a single staple crop, whether wheat, rice, or maize, which meant that if the harvest failed, starvation followed. Farming also demanded labor, long hours of tilling, planting, weeding, and harvesting. The work was repetitive, seasonal, and physically taxing. But it was consistent, and it allowed something new, surplus. For the first time, communities could grow more food than they immediately needed. This extra grain could be stored, traded, or offered as tribute. It also created inequality. Some controlled the food, others worked the land. Social hierarchies began to form. Elders, priests, landowners, laborers. Over time, power concentrated. Small village councils gave way to chieftains. Kinship lines solidified into early aristocracies. And surplus grain became a form of currency, one that could be traded, taxed, or seized. Animals, too, were drawn into this changing world. In the Middle East, humans domesticated sheep, goats, and later cattle. In Central Asia, horses were eventually tamed. In East Asia, pigs became a staple. These animals provided meat, milk, hides, and muscle. They pulled plows, carried loads, and gave rise to pastoralist societies that thrived on open plains and steppe lands, herders who moved with their flocks, even as others remained rooted to the soil. With domestication came companionship. The earliest dogs had already formed bonds with humans during their hunting days, but now they were joined by cats, oxen, and more. Some animals became symbols of status, or even sacred. Others were used in rituals or sacrifices. Human life and animal life grew more entangled with each generation. In Mesopotamia, along the rivers that nurtured the first fields, villages grew into towns, and towns into cities. Irrigation systems were dug to control the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates. Canals channeled water to thirsty crops. Levees were raised. With these networks came coordination and the need for leadership, planning, and record-keeping. The agricultural revolution thus planted the seeds not only of food, but of governance, to track harvests, debts, and trades. Early societies developed proto-writing, markings on clay tablets, tallies cut into sticks, and symbols pressed into stone. Over time, these became full writing systems, such as cuneiform in Mesopotamia, and later hieroglyphs in Egypt. The need to record the movement of grain led to the invention of literacy, and with it, history as we know it. Meanwhile, far from the Fertile Crescent, other farming worlds blossomed in parallel. In the Indus Valley, vast cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro would eventually rise, their foundations built on early agricultural practices rooted in the floodplains of the Indus River. In China, along the Yellow River, millet and rice cultivation sustained settlements that would give rise to dynasties. In Mesoamerica, early maize farmers shaped the future of the Maya, Aztec, and other great civilizations still centuries away. Each region followed its own path, but the turning point was shared. Where once humans followed the land, now the land followed them. Forests were cleared, rivers diverted, hills terraced. The world was being reshaped by human hands. The agricultural revolution did not mark the end of foraging. Even as farming spread, many groups continued to hunt and gather, some to this day. But for the majority of humanity, the shift was irreversible. With fields came fences, with granaries came governance, with settled life came stories rooted in place, myths of fertility, of harvest gods, of cycles of life and death tied to the sowing and reaping of crops. This shift would define the human experience for the next 10,000 years. And so, the age of wandering gave way to the age of roots. From seed to sprout, from hoe to harvest, from village to temple, the world had entered a new chapter. It was no longer just about surviving the world. Now, it was about shaping it. The birth of civilization. The fields had been planted, the harvests had come, granaries were filled, temples rose from the earth, and rivers no longer flowed past simple villages, but beside something new, cities. Civilization had begun. Its birth did not come from a single act, nor did it appear in just one place. Instead, over the course of centuries, across many parts of the world, human societies took on new shapes. They became more complex, more hierarchical, more ordered, and in many ways, more fragile. In the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, an area known as Mesopotamia, meaning the land between rivers, the first true cities emerged. By 4000 BCE, a city called Eridu stood on the southern edge of the Mesopotamian plain. Soon it was followed by Uruk, which would grow to house tens of thousands of people, an immense number for the time. At its height, Uruk had massive stone walls stretching several miles around its perimeter, towering temples known as ziggurats, and a dense network of streets, courtyards, and workshops. It may have been the largest city in the world. Uruk marked a shift from village life to urban living, a shift that required not only more food, but new forms of cooperation and control. To function, a city needed organization. It needed rules, roles, and rituals. It needed scribes to count grain, soldiers to guard gates, priests to appease the gods, and leaders to issue decrees. And so, slowly, something remarkable took shape: the state. Early states were fragile and ever-changing. Power was often tied to religious authority. Kings claimed divine favor or descent from the gods. In Sumer, the southern region of Mesopotamia, city-states like Lagash, and Kish each had their own patron deities. Towering temples rose from their centers, built in stepped layers, like mountains made by human hands. These ziggurats were not just houses of worship, but centers of administration, trade, and ritual. The Sumerians developed writing not as art, but as accounting. The earliest script, cuneiform, began as pictographs pressed into wet clay using a reed stylus. It recorded things like shipments of grain, offerings to temples, or debts owed. Over time, these symbols became more abstract, capable of capturing names, laws, and stories. From the dust of ancient record-keeping came the first written literature. Around 2100 BCE, Sumerian scribes compiled the Epic of Gilgamesh, a mythic poem recounting the adventures of a powerful king, his friendship with a wild man named Enkidu, and his search for immortality. The story includes a great flood, a serpent of renewal, and the ache of human mortality. It is, in many ways, the world's oldest known story, and one that still echoes themes familiar to us today. But the birth of civilization was not just about stories or cities. It was about systems. Irrigation canals brought water from distant rivers into dry fields. Scribes maintained tax records and inventories. Artisans specialized, some in metalwork, others in pottery, others in textiles. Trade expanded. Ships moved up and down rivers. Caravans crossed deserts, laden with goods. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedarwood from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, spices from India. In these cities, people no longer knew everyone around them. This was a new kind of life, one built not on kinship alone, but on institution. People were sorted into roles: merchants, laborers, officials, slaves. Caste and class began to shape a person's future from birth. Some wore fine linens and drank beer from golden cups. Others hauled bricks beneath the sun or served in households not their own. Civilization brought culture, but also inequality. Laws emerged to manage this growing complexity. Around 1750 BCE, in the city of Babylon, King Hammurabi issued one of the earliest known legal codes. Inscribed in stone, it declared that justice would be carried out to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. The Code of Hammurabi listed hundreds of laws, rules about theft, trade, marriage, debt, and punishment. It established the principle that laws should be written, predictable, and enforced across a society. Though its penalties were often harsh and hierarchical, it marked a step toward the idea of governance by rule rather than whim. Civilization also meant urban infrastructure. Roads were laid with clay and crushed stone. Public buildings were erected with brick and timber. In some cities, waste was channeled through early drainage systems. Courtyards allowed air and light into tightly packed homes. Markets bustled with sellers offering grain, oils, incense, and fabrics. Music echoed through alleyways, harps, lyres, and flutes accompanying hymns and dances. Beyond Mesopotamia, similar transformations unfolded. In the Nile Valley, Egyptian civilization flourished along the predictable rhythms of the river. Every year, the Nile would rise and flood its banks, depositing rich silt that made the surrounding land fertile. This natural cycle supported large-scale agriculture and, in turn, centralized power. By 3000 BCE, the kingdom of Upper Egypt had united with Lower Egypt, creating a single realm ruled by a divine king, the pharaoh. These rulers were seen not merely as political leaders, but as living gods, intermediaries between the human and the divine. Egyptian civilization was deeply intertwined with ritual, the afterlife, and monumental architecture. Great stone pyramids were constructed, tombs that aligned with celestial bodies and were filled with treasures for the soul's journey beyond death. Writing systems, such as hieroglyphics, covered tomb walls and temple pillars. These were not just decorations, they were spells, prayers, records, and names meant to echo through eternity. Meanwhile, along the Indus River, a civilization rose that would become one of the most enigmatic of the ancient world. At sites like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, archaeologists have uncovered vast cities with advanced grid layouts, standardized brick sizes, and even what appear to be indoor plumbing systems, centuries ahead of their time. The people of the Indus Valley built massive public baths, stored grain in centralized warehouses, and engaged in trade as far afield as Mesopotamia. And yet, curiously, we still cannot read their writing. Despite finding thousands of inscribed seals and tablets, the Indus script remains undeciphered. No royal palaces, no monumental temples, no evidence of centralized kingship has been conclusively found, suggesting a civilization organized differently from its contemporaries. In China, along the Yellow River, early cultures like the Yangshao and Longshan were laying the groundwork for dynastic rule. They built walled settlements, buried their dead with jade and pottery, and began to domesticate silkworms, a craft that would eventually make China the heart of the Silk Road centuries later. Bronze casting flourished. Ritual vessels were made with stunning precision, and by the time of the Shang dynasty, emerging around 1600 BCE, A sophisticated system of writing, ancestor worship, and royal authority had taken root. What bound these early civilizations together, despite distance, language, and belief, was a shared pattern: the rise of organized governance, permanent cities, complex economies, and cultural identity. But they also shared vulnerability. Floods could destroy cities. Droughts could starve populations. Invasion, internal rebellion, or disease could bring down entire systems. Civilization, for all its wonders, required balance. It was not just a triumph of ingenuity. It was a constant negotiation with nature, with neighbors, and with the needs of growing populations. And yet, for all its fragility, civilization endured. It allowed humans to build not just shelter, but legacy. It gave rise to literature, law, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. It allowed ideas to spread through trade, conquest, migration, and marriage. It encouraged the invention of the wheel, the calendar, the sail, the plow, and the stylus. It turned scattered settlements into centers of gravity. It made us not just survivors of the earth, but stewards, interpreters, and reshapers of it. From the reeds of Mesopotamia to the granite temples of Egypt, from the undeciphered seals of the Indus Valley to the bronze vessels of ancient China, the birth of civilization was a turning point unlike any before. Humans had gathered not just to farm or hunt, but to live together in great numbers under shared beliefs and systems. They had become urban, political, spiritual, economic, and artistic beings, all at once, and the world would never be the same. Egypt, pyramids, and the Nile. Long before the rise of Greece or Rome, while the world elsewhere still stirred in village hearths and early city-states, one river gave rise to one of the most iconic civilizations in human history, a civilization that would endure not for centuries, but for millennia. It began along the banks of the Nile, the longest river on Earth, stretching over 4,000 miles from deep in the heart of Africa to the blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea. In a land where the surrounding deserts were vast, dry, and unforgiving, the Nile became more than a waterway. It was a lifeline, a calendar, a god. Every year, with stunning regularity, the Nile would flood. It would swell its banks, spill across the valleys, and then gently recede, leaving behind a thick layer of rich, dark silt, perfect for planting wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. This annual rhythm, so dependable and generous, allowed the Egyptian people to flourish early and abundantly. They came to call their land Kemet, the black land, in contrast to the surrounding Deshret, the red land of the desert. By around 3100 BCE, the kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt were united under a single ruler, Nama, also known as Menes. This unification marked the beginning of the early dynastic period, and with it, Egypt's long and layered journey through history began. The ruler of this new kingdom would not simply be a king. He would be known as the Pharaoh, a title meaning great house, symbolic of divine authority. The Pharaoh was more than mortal, more than sovereign. He was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship. And upon his death, he would become one with Osiris, lord of the underworld. To serve the Pharaoh was to serve the gods themselves. This divine status shaped everything: governance, architecture, rituals, and even the geography of cities and temples. Temples were aligned with the stars. Statues gazed eternally east toward the rising sun. Life in Egypt became a dance between earth and sky, between the mortal and the eternal. By the time of the Old Kingdom, around 2686 BCE, Egypt was a realm of wealth, organization, and enormous ambition. It was during this period that the Egyptians undertook one of the most astonishing architectural feats in human history: the construction of the pyramids. not tombs hastily carved into mountainsides, nor mere monuments of stone. These were colossal, geometric marvels designed to touch the heavens. The first pyramid was built for the pharaoh Djoser, designed by his brilliant architect Imhotep. Unlike anything that had come before, this was a step pyramid, a series of stone terraces stacked into a stairway for the soul. Later came the Great Pyramids of Giza, built during the 4th Dynasty. The largest of them all, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, rose nearly 150 meters into the sky and remained the tallest man-made structure on Earth for over 3,800 years. It was composed of more than 2 million stone blocks, each weighing several tons, precisely placed without the aid of modern machinery. How they were built remains partly a mystery. Ramps, sledges, counterweights, all have been proposed. But what is certain is that these structures were not simply feats of engineering. They were acts of devotion, of cosmic alignment, of legacy. They were designed to house the Ka, the soul, of the pharaoh for eternity, complete with chambers, corridors, traps, and carefully calculated angles that mirrored constellations and sacred geometry. Nearby, the Sphinx stood watch, a lion's body with a human head, carved from a single mass of limestone. Weathered by time, it still gazes east toward the dawn, a symbol of strength and vigilance. While the pharaohs and priests shaped the upper echelons of society, the life of the average Egyptian was tied closely to the land and the river. Farmers worked in rhythm with the flooding cycles. They plowed the soil with wooden tools, harvested by hand, and offered portions of their yield to the temples. Fishermen cast nets into the reeds. Craftsmen carved amulets and beads. Bakers ground grain into flour for flatbread baked in clay ovens. Egyptian society was remarkably organized, stratified, but also stable. Scribes, trained from a young age, kept detailed records on papyrus, from tax rolls to religious texts. Soldiers protected trade routes and borders. Artisans filled workshops with pottery, furniture, and sculpture. Women could own property, initiate divorce, and work in professions, a relative rarity in the ancient world. And at the heart of it all was a belief in Ma'at, the concept of balance, harmony, order, and truth. Ma'at was not just a philosophical ideal, but a divine principle, personified as a goddess with a feather upon her head. Pharaohs were tasked with upholding Ma'at, and every judgment, from legal cases to ritual offerings, was meant to preserve this cosmic balance. This reverence for order extended into the realm of the dead. Egyptians believed in an intricate afterlife. When a person died, their ba, their personality or soul, would journey through the Duat, the realm of the dead, filled with rivers, gates, guardians, and trials. At the end of this journey came the weighing of the heart, in which the heart was placed on a scale opposite the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by a monstrous creature named Amit, part crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus. But if it was light, the soul would continue on to the eternal field of reeds, a perfect mirror of life on earth. To prepare for this journey, the dead were embalmed. Organs were removed and placed in canopic jars. The body was dried with natron salts and wrapped in linen. Charms and amulets were placed between the layers, and sacred texts, like the Book of the Dead, were buried alongside, providing spells and guidance for the soul's perilous journey. This meticulous preparation reflected a civilization deeply concerned with memory, legacy, and the continuity of the spirit. As time passed, dynasties rose and fell. The centralized authority of the Old Kingdom gave way to fragmentation during what is now called the First Intermediate Period. Civil war, drought, and decentralization marked this era, yet from it emerged renewal. The Middle Kingdom brought a return to unity around 2055 BCE. Pharaohs ruled from Thebes, temples expanded, literature flourished. New building projects began, yet with prosperity came new pressures. Borders were pushed. Foreign peoples, particularly the Hyksos, entered the Nile Delta and brought with them new weapons, like the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow. Rather than collapse, Egypt adapted. Under the New Kingdom, which began around 1550 BCE, Egypt entered its golden age of empire. Pharaohs like Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Ramesses II led military campaigns deep into Nubia and the Levant. Egypt became an imperial power, its borders stretching far beyond the Nile Valley. Temples became even more elaborate. The Karnak temple complex near Luxor, dedicated primarily to Amun-Ra, sprawled over 200 acres. Colossal statues of seated pharaohs lined the entrances. Obelisks soared skyward, their tips gilded in gold to catch the sun's first light. Perhaps no New Kingdom ruler is more fascinating than Akhenaten, a pharaoh who attempted to revolutionize Egypt's religion by worshipping a single deity, the sun disk known as Aten. He moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, and commissioned a new artistic style, one more fluid, natural, and intimate. But after his death, the old gods returned. His son, the boy king Tutankhamun, would reverse his reforms, restoring traditional beliefs. Tutankhamun's name would fade from memory, until 1922, when British archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered his nearly intact tomb, filled with gold, lapis, and extraordinary craftsmanship. It remains one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in history. The New Kingdom eventually gave way to decline. Foreign powers gained influence. The Sea Peoples ravaged the eastern Mediterranean. Internal unrest grew. Egypt would be ruled in later centuries by Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and eventually Romans. And yet, through it all, something remained enduring. Egypt never truly disappeared. Its symbols, the Ankh, the scarab, the Eye of Horus, still appear in jewelry, tattoos, and art today. Its language, though transformed, echoes in the scripts of Coptic Christians. Its pyramids still rise from the desert like sentinels of time, weathered by sandstorms and centuries, yet refusing to crumble. The civilization of ancient Egypt lasted for over 3,000 years, longer than any modern nation-state has existed. It gave the world ideas of divine kingship, monumental architecture, written language, astronomy, mathematics, and the concept of an afterlife shaped by moral judgment. But more than that, it gave us a glimpse of how a society, shaped by the rhythms of a single river, could dream so grandly that its monuments would still stand, whispering across the millennia. And so the Nile continues to flow, as it did then, as it does now, quiet, ancient, eternal. The Indus and the East. As the great pyramids rose beside the Nile, and ziggurats cast their shadows across the Mesopotamian plains, a quieter, more mysterious civilization was already thriving to the east. A world of red brick cities, broad streets, and orderly design. Far from the familiar records of pharaohs and kings, in the fertile valley of the Indus River, another great human story was unfolding. It was a civilization without towering statues or warlike inscriptions. It left behind no grand palaces, no self-glorifying monuments, no chronicles carved in stone to honor rulers or victories. And yet, what it did leave behind, in the dust of time, suggests a people who were remarkably sophisticated, deeply organized, and quietly powerful. The Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, began to flourish around 2600 BCE, though its roots stretch back even further to Neolithic farming communities that settled near riverbanks and seasonal streams. Over centuries, these settlements grew, joined, and evolved into an urban network stretching across what is now Pakistan, northwestern India, and parts of Afghanistan. At its peak, the Indus Valley Civilization covered more territory than either Egypt or Mesopotamia at the time, spanning over 1 million square kilometers. And yet, Despite its scale, its cities were unified by a common system of weights, measures, urban planning, and perhaps even governance. Two of the most prominent cities were Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Walking through their ruins today, one can still see the traces of a remarkably advanced society, not grandiose, but orderly, efficient, and practical in ways that seem astonishingly modern. Streets were laid out in grid patterns, intersecting at right angles. Buildings were constructed using uniform baked bricks, suggesting standardized production and centralized oversight. Many homes were multi-storied, with staircases and flat rooftops. Some had indoor bathrooms, and an advanced drainage system connected homes to covered street drains, something that would not be seen again in many parts of the world for thousands of years. In Mohenjo-Daro, a vast public structure known as the Great Bath sits at the center of the city. Built from finely fitted bricks and sealed with bitumen, it was filled and drained using a complex system of water channels. It may have served as a place of ritual purification, or perhaps communal bathing, a space where cleanliness and ceremony were intertwined. Grain storage was also centralized. Enormous granaries with ventilation shafts and loading platforms suggest not only surplus production, but planned distribution. The economy appears to have been rooted in agriculture, supported by seasonal floods from the Indus and its tributaries. Wheat, barley, sesame, and cotton were cultivated. Cotton textiles from this period are among the earliest known examples in the world. Domesticated animals included cattle, buffalo, goats, and even elephants. Trade reached far beyond the valley. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone mined in distant Afghanistan, has been found in Harappan jewelry. Seals, carved with animal motifs and mysterious script, have been discovered as far west as Mesopotamia, suggesting robust contact and exchange. These Indus seals remain one of the civilization's enduring enigmas. Made of steatite and pressed with intricate symbols, they likely marked goods or served as amulets. Some depict unicorn-like creatures, seated yogis, or ritual scenes. Others show short inscriptions, elegant, abstract characters from a script that even today has never been deciphered. No bilingual text has ever been found. No Rosetta Stone to break the code. As a result, we do not know the names of their cities as they called them. We do not know the names of their rulers, if they had rulers. No known temples have been uncovered, no images of gods in grand form, no clear evidence of a centralized priesthood. This silence has led many to speculate that the Indus people may have been uniquely egalitarian for their time, possibly governed by councils or collectives, rather than monarchs or divine kings. Perhaps power was distributed rather than concentrated. Perhaps status was measured not in golden thrones, but in craftsmanship, trade, or wisdom. Yet for all their order, the civilization eventually began to decline. By around 1900 BCE, signs of change began to appear. Urban centers were gradually abandoned. Construction standards weakened. Trade links diminished. What caused this unraveling remains unclear and deeply debated. One theory points to climate change. Shifting monsoon patterns may have reduced water flow in the Ghaggar-Hakra River, once possibly part of the ancient Saraswati, mentioned in later Indian texts. Droughts could have made farming unsustainable. Another theory suggests tectonic activity may have altered river courses, or that slow ecological degradation wore down the land's fertility. There is no evidence of widespread warfare or destruction. No burned layers, no invading armies etched into stone. Instead, the collapse seems to have been quiet, gradual abandonment, fragmentation, and migration towards smaller rural settlements. Yet even in decline, the legacy of the Indus lived on. Cultural practices, art styles, agricultural knowledge, and possibly spiritual ideas would continue to echo in the subcontinent's later traditions. Some scholars believe the roots of yoga, of sacred bathing, and even of later Hindu symbolism may stretch back to these ancient people. As the Indus faded, a new wave of cultural energy was building to the east, across the towering Himalayas, in the rich and river-laced valleys of ancient China. Here, around the Yellow River, or Huanghe, farming communities had long been cultivating millet and domesticating pigs, dogs, and chickens. In the wetter south, rice paddies were being developed in the Yangtze River basin, supported by advanced irrigation. By around 2000 BCE, the Longshan culture began to exhibit traits of early statehood: walled towns, defensive ditches, and highly polished black pottery. Jade carving reached new levels of artistry, and early ritual objects suggest a deepening hierarchy and emerging elites. Then came the rise of the Jia dynasty, considered by tradition to be China's first dynasty, though archaeological evidence remains fragmentary. More clearly attested is the Shang dynasty, which emerged around 1600 BCE. The Shang left behind a wealth of artifacts, most notably their bronze vessels, used in rituals to honor ancestors and spirits. These bronzes, cast using complex piece mold techniques, were decorated with intricate Tayoti masks, symmetrical, zoomorphic faces that still provoke fascination and mystery. The Shang also developed one of the earliest forms of Chinese writing. Inscribed on oracle bones, pieces of ox scapulae or turtle shells used in divination. Questions were carved into the bone, often about harvests, weather, war, or childbirth. Then the bone was heated until it cracked. The patterns of the cracks were interpreted by diviners, and the answers were also recorded, creating an archive of royal concerns and ritual practice. These inscriptions evolved into the Chinese script still in use today, making it one of the longest continuously used writing systems in the world. The Shang court was centered in cities like Anyang, where vast palaces and royal tombs have been excavated. Nobles controlled bronze workshops, slave labor, and military forces. Chariots were used in warfare, drawn by teams of horses and accompanied by archers. Human sacrifice, though rare in world history, appears to have been practiced here, with servants and prisoners buried alongside kings. At the same time, other parts of China were developing distinct cultural traditions. The Sangxingdui civilization, in what is now Sichuan province, produced gigantic bronze masks with bulging eyes and exaggerated features, unlike anything found in the Yellow River Valley. Their purpose is still unknown. Were they gods, ancestors, guardians? Their uniqueness suggests that early China was not a single cultural stream, but a braided river of beliefs and identities. As centuries passed, the Shang gave way to the Zhou dynasty, which introduced the concept of the mandate of heaven, the belief that rulers held power only so long as they governed justly. If they grew corrupt or unjust, heaven would withdraw its favor, and rebellion would be justified. This idea would shape Chinese political thought for over 2,000 years. But even here, in these early chapters, we see something profound emerging. In the Indus and in China, people were not just surviving, they were building systems of trade, of measurement, of belief. They aligned cities with stars, carved symbols into bone and seal, traced ancestry through ritual and myth. They built not only with bricks and bronze, but with ideas that would carry forward into empires, into philosophies, into the enduring identities of great civilizations. Though their languages differ, though their monuments may rise in different forms, their stories share a quiet commonality, a movement toward structure, toward meaning, and toward memory. Even in silence, even when their scripts go unread and their gods unnamed, they continue to speak. In riverbeds and ruins, in the patterns of streets, the curves of jade, the lines carved into stone. Warriors and philosophy in the Mediterranean. Along the glittering shores of the eastern Mediterranean, where olive trees twist in the dry summer breeze, and waves lap gently at rocky coves, another great chapter of human history began to unfold. One not defined only by empire or irrigation, but by story, spirit, and the search for wisdom. This was a world of islands and harbors, of high hills and open sea, where the people were shaped as much by the water between them as by the land beneath their feet. Before Greece as we know it, there were other civilizations, older, now shrouded in partial mystery. The earliest of these was the Minoan civilization, centered on the island of Crete, rising around 2000 BCE. The Minoans did not build great walled cities or wage vast wars. Instead, they created something elegant, graceful, and different. At Knossos, the largest Minoan city, an enormous palace complex once stood. Not a fortress, but a sprawling labyrinth of storerooms, staircases, courtyards, and ceremonial spaces. Its walls were painted with vibrant frescoes, dolphins leaping through azure waves, women with flounced skirts and bare arms dancing or gathering flowers, acrobats flipping over charging bulls. The Minoans were master seafarers and traders, sending ships across the Aegean and beyond. They developed their own writing system, Linear A, which remains undeciphered to this day. Their society appeared, at least in part, to revere goddesses, fertility, nature, and animals playing central roles in their art and iconography. But around 1450 BCE, Minoan influence waned and a new power emerged, one more martial, more austere, yet no less important to the story of the Mediterranean. These were the Mycenaeans, based on the Greek mainland. Unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans built fortified citadels on high ground, with thick walls and megarons, great halls for feasting and rule. They left behind Linear B, an early Greek script that has been deciphered, offering glimpses into palace life, inventories, and bureaucratic lists. The Mycenaeans were likely the cultural memory behind the great heroes of later Greek epics. Names like Agamemnon, Menelaus, and Odysseus may have once walked the windswept halls of Mycenae, or sailed the wine-dark seas in search of glory, vengeance, or home. And then, mysteriously, around 1200 BCE, the palaces of the Mycenaeans were abandoned. Their system collapsed, part of a wider upheaval known as the Bronze Age collapse, which saw empires and kingdoms from Anatolia to Egypt shaken or destroyed. What followed was a Greek Dark Age, a time of decline, of smaller settlements, of forgotten literacy. But even in this shadowed age, stories survived. These tales were carried by poets and bards, passed from generation to generation beside fires and in village squares. Songs of wrath and honor, of gods and men, of war and the longing for home. By the time writing returned to Greece, this time with a borrowed Phoenician alphabet, these stories were written down, and two epics stood above the rest. The Iliad and the Odyssey, attributed to Homer, became foundational texts for Greek identity. In the Iliad, the wrath of Achilles rages against the backdrop of the Trojan War. In the Odyssey, the cunning Odysseus endures storms, monsters, and temptation on his long journey back to Ithaca. But these were not mere tales of battle. They spoke of pride, fate, honor, and the bonds between mortals and the divine. They shaped the Greek soul, a soul deeply torn between reason and passion, chaos and order, war and beauty. By 800 BCE, Greek city-states, or polis, had begun to emerge across the Aegean world. Each polis was independent, fiercely proud, and unique in character. There was Athens, known for its love of wisdom and debate. Sparta, defined by discipline and martial prowess. Corinth, a hub of trade and wealth. Delphi, sacred to the god Apollo. And many others, Thebes, Rhodes, Ephesus, dotting the mainland and scattered islands. These polis shared a language, a pantheon of gods, and festivals such as the Olympic Games, first held in 776 BCE at Olympia, where men competed in running, wrestling, and chariot races in honor of Zeus. Yet they were often in conflict, forming alliances, breaking them, going to war, and reconciling again. One of the most powerful forces in early Greek life was religion, though it was not dogmatic or uniform. The Greek gods were many, and very human. They loved, feuded, schemed, and punished. They resided on Mount Olympus, yet interfered often in mortal affairs. Zeus with his thunderbolt, Athena with her wisdom, Apollo, the god of music and prophecy, Artemis, goddess of the hunt, Dionysus, of wine and madness. Temples rose in their honor, pillared sanctuaries of stone where offerings were left and oracles consulted. The Greeks did not believe in salvation through the gods, but in honoring them, fearing their wrath, and living a life of arete, excellence, in whatever path one chose. But perhaps the most lasting gift of ancient Greece was not its temples or statues, but its thought. In Athens, during the 5th century BCE, a period of unparalleled intellectual flowering began. It was a time of theatre, democracy, architecture, and of philosophy. The Athenians developed a radical idea that citizens, free male citizens at least, could govern themselves. The ecclesia, or assembly, allowed them to vote on laws. The bull, a council of 500, was selected by lot. Jury duty was a civic obligation. Speeches, persuasion, and rhetoric became central to political life. It was within this buzzing, disputing, questioning city that Socrates walked. Socrates asked questions, simple ones, uncomfortable ones. What is justice? What is virtue? How should one live? He claimed to know nothing, and in doing so, he revealed how little others knew. His method, the Socratic method, involved dialogue, probing, contradiction. He left no writings, only impressions recorded by his student, Plato. Socrates was eventually sentenced to death, accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. He drank hemlock calmly, refusing to flee, a philosopher to the last breath. Plato, haunted by his teacher's death, founded the Academy, one of the world's first institutions of higher learning. In his dialogues, he imagined a world of perfect forms, eternal truths, and the ideal republic, ruled not by warriors or merchants, but by philosopher kings. His student, Aristotle, would take a different path. A tireless observer, he believed in the concrete, the observable, the classified. He studied plants, animals, ethics, politics, logic, and rhetoric. He tutored Alexander the Great, whose conquests would later spread Greek culture across 3 continents. The Greeks also excelled in drama, tragic and comic alike. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides explored the human condition through stories of kings, curses, and divine injustice. Aristophanes mocked politics and war with biting humor. In open-air theaters, thousands would gather under the stars to watch actors in masks enact the fate of mortals and gods. In art, the Greeks sought harmony, proportion, and movement. Sculptors carved marble into lifelike forms, the Discobolus mid-throw, the Venus de Milo half-smiling, the Laocoon writhing in anguish. Their architecture, most famously the Parthenon, used mathematical precision to evoke balance and grace. But Greek unity was always fragile. In 431 BCE, a bitter war broke out between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War. It dragged on for nearly 30 years, weakening both sides and ushering in a period of instability. Eventually, a new power rose from the north, Macedon under Philip II, and later his son, Alexander. Alexander the Great, educated in Aristotle's shadow, would conquer the Persian Empire, reach the edges of India, and establish cities from Alexandria in Egypt to Bactria in Central Asia. Though he died young, his conquests ushered in the Hellenistic Age, a time when Greek language, art, and philosophy mingled with Egyptian, Persian, and Indian traditions. The legacy of ancient Greece is not a single moment, but a collection of questions and aspirations. What is justice? What is the good life? How should we live in a world of beauty and suffering? Their answers were not perfect. Their society was exclusive, their politics fragile. But the questions they asked continue to echo in lecture halls, libraries, and late-night conversations. Along the rocky shores of the Mediterranean, among the ruins of temples and the faded ink of ancient scrolls, we still hear the voices of warriors and poets, of thinkers and dreamers, calling out across time, not with certainty, but with wonder. The rise and rule of Rome. In the rolling hills of central Italy, far from the palaces of Egypt or the stone temples of Greece, a small cluster of settlements once stood near the banks of the Tiber River. The land was fertile, the climate mild, and the hills, 7 of them, offered natural protection. It was here, according to legend, that 2 brothers were raised by a she-wolf. Their names were Romulus and Remus, sons of a mortal woman and the war god Mars. They quarreled over where to build their new city. In the end, Romulus struck down his brother and gave his name to what would become one of the greatest powers the world has ever known, Rome. Whether myth or memory, this tale marked the beginning of a city that would rise from obscurity to command an empire stretching from the wind-swept moors of Britain to the sands of Arabia, from the Rhine and Danube to the Nile and Euphrates. The earliest Romans lived among other Latin tribes, Etruscans to the north and Greek colonies to the south. They absorbed influences, Etruscan architecture and rituals, Greek gods and alphabet, and slowly grew from monarchy to republic. By 509 BCE, the last Roman king, Tarquin the Proud, was overthrown, and a new system of government emerged, the Roman Republic. This was not democracy as we think of it today, but it was a radical shift. Power was now held by the Senate, a council of aristocratic men known as patricians, and by elected magistrates called consuls. These consuls, 2 at a time, served for 1 year only, each able to check the other's power. Beneath them, other officials handled law, justice, and finance. In times of crisis, a dictator could be appointed, but only for 6 months. Ordinary citizens, known as plebeians, fought for political inclusion. Through strikes, protests, and negotiation, they gained rights, including the tribune of the plebs, an office with the power to veto legislation. The struggle between patricians and plebeians defined much of early Roman politics and helped shape a republic built on law, precedent, and compromise. Rome's society was highly structured, bound by mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors. Loyalty to family, discipline, frugality, and service to the state were core Roman virtues. Children were taught to respect their elders, to endure hardship without complaint, and to place honor above comfort. The Romans were also formidable soldiers. Their army, the legions, was not built around glory or individual heroism, but discipline, training, and organization. Legionnaires drilled daily, marched in formation, and followed orders with precision. They built roads, forts, and siege engines as they conquered. Every camp was laid out the same way, a grid of streets, walls, gates, a temporary city ready to become permanent. As the Republic expanded, it encountered rival powers, most notably Carthage, a wealthy maritime empire in North Africa. The Punic Wars, fought between 264 and 146 BCE, were brutal and defining. In the Second Punic War, the Carthaginian general Hannibal led an army, including war elephants, over the Alps into Italy, winning stunning victories at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae. For years, he ravaged the countryside, but could not capture Rome itself. Eventually, the Roman general Scipio Africanus took the fight to Carthage, defeating Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. By the end of the Third Punic War, Carthage was utterly destroyed, its city razed, its fields salted, its people enslaved. Rome now controlled the western Mediterranean. But victory brought strain. As wealth poured in from conquered lands, inequality deepened. The rich bought up farmland, worked by slaves taken in war. The poor flooded into Rome, living in crowded tenements, unemployed and restless. Corruption grew. The Senate, meant to serve the state, often served only itself. Reformers like Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus tried to redistribute land and grain, but were met with violence. Politics grew bloody. Armies became loyal not to the Republic, but to generals who promised them land and spoils. One of these generals was Gaius Julius Caesar. Brilliant, ambitious, and bold, Caesar rose through the ranks. He conquered Gaul, modern-day France, in a brutal, years-long campaign that brought Rome vast new territories and made him a hero to the people. But the Senate feared his power. When ordered to disband his army, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, a point of no return. Civil war followed. Caesar emerged victorious and was declared dictator for life. Some saw him as a savior. Others saw the end of the Republic. In 44 BCE, on the Ides of March, Caesar was assassinated by senators led by Brutus and Cassius, who hoped to restore the old order. Instead, they plunged Rome into further chaos. Another civil war followed. Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, defeated his rivals, including the famed Mark Antony and Cleopatra of Egypt, and consolidated power. In 27 BCE, he became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Though he kept the facade of the Republic, real power now lay with him. The Roman Empire had begun. Augustus brought stability, prosperity, and reform. He professionalized the army, restructured the government, built roads and aqueducts, and initiated an era of peace known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which would last for over 2 centuries. Under the emperors, Rome became the heart of a vast empire, a sprawling web of roads, cities, and cultures. At its height, the empire included Britain, Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, Egypt, Greece, Anatolia, and much of the Middle East. Each region retained its language and customs, but Roman law, coinage, architecture, and citizenship unified the whole. Latin became the language of governance, Greek of philosophy and literature. Together, they shaped the intellectual foundation of Europe. Rome's cities were marvels of engineering. Aqueducts carried fresh water for miles. Bathhouses, forums, and amphitheaters provided public life and entertainment. The Colosseum, completed in 80 CE, could seat over 50,000 spectators who came to watch gladiatorial games, beast hunts, and naval reenactments. Religion, once centered on the old Roman pantheon, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, slowly expanded. Mystery cults arrived from the east. Egyptian deities, Persian rituals, and local gods all found a place. Then came Christianity, born in a distant Roman province under the rule of Pontius Pilate, who presided over the crucifixion of a man named Jesus of Nazareth. At first, Christianity was a persecuted faith, its followers arrested, martyred, or forced into secrecy. But over time, it spread, through traders, letters, and missionary journeys. It appealed to the poor, to women, to slaves, offering salvation, dignity, and hope. In the early 4th century, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance. He moved the capital east to Byzantium, later renamed Constantinople. Christianity grew from a fringe sect to the dominant faith of the empire. But as faith grew, Rome faltered. By the late 4th and 5th centuries, the Western Roman Empire faced relentless pressure. Economic instability, internal corruption, and invasions by so-called barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Huns. In 410 CE, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths, a shock to the ancient world. In 476 CE, the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. The Western Empire was gone, but the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, would endure for nearly 1,000 more years, and the legacy of Rome never truly disappeared. Its laws became the basis for legal systems across Europe. Its language shaped Italian, French, Spanish, and more. Its architecture inspired cathedrals, capitals, and courts. Its roads became the veins of medieval commerce. Its Senate and Republic became models for modern democracy. And its ideas of citizenship, of civic duty, of individual rights and empire still echo through the centuries. Rome was not merely a place. It was a system, a story, a symbol, a city that rose from a shepherd's hut on the Tiber to a realm that spanned continents. And though its empire fell, its memory would never fade. Faith, empires, and the medieval world. When Rome fell, it did not vanish. Its roads still stretched across Europe. Its aqueducts still flowed. Its lore and memory lingered in stones and scrolls. But in the centuries that followed, the Western world began to take on a different shape, fragmented, spiritual, and searching for order in the ruins of a collapsed empire. The early medieval world, sometimes called the Dark Ages, was not a time of complete darkness. It was a time of transition, of adaptation, and, most profoundly, of faith. In the former Western Roman Empire, power fractured into smaller kingdoms. Local warlords, tribal chieftains, and emerging monarchs carved out territories, some in Britain, others in Gaul, in Iberia, in Italy. The unifying force was no longer an emperor, but a church. Christianity, once outlawed and hunted, had become the dominant faith of Europe. It reached into every village and valley, into the minds of kings and the hearts of peasants. Monasteries dotted the landscape, havens of quiet scholarship and discipline. Within their stone walls, monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, preserving not just scripture, but ancient Greek and Roman texts, works of medicine, astronomy, logic, and poetry, saving the past for a future not yet imagined. The Bishop of Rome, known as the Pope, grew in spiritual authority, claiming descent from the Apostle Peter. Though actual power waxed and waned, the papacy emerged as a central institution, shaping doctrine, kingship, and the rhythm of medieval life. Across the Mediterranean, another world was forming, not born from the ashes of Rome, but from the deserts of Arabia. In the 7th century, a merchant named Muhammad began to receive revelations outside the city of Mecca. These verses, compiled as the Quran, proclaimed the oneness of God, Allah, and called humanity to righteousness, justice, and compassion. Muhammad was not just a prophet, but a statesman, a unifier, a reformer. His message spread rapidly, first across the Arabian Peninsula, then beyond. After his death in 632 CE, a series of caliphates expanded Islam across an astonishing range, from Spain in the west to India in the east, forming one of the largest and most culturally rich empires in history. The Umayyad and later Abbasid caliphates governed not just through conquest, but through commerce, scholarship, and administration. Cities like Damascus, Cordoba, and Baghdad became centers of learning and culture. In Baghdad, under the Abbasids, the House of Wisdom was established, a great library and academy where scholars of many faiths translated ancient Greek texts into Arabic. Mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and medicine flourished. Algebra, algorithms, surgical tools, and celestial charts all advanced in these golden centuries. In the West, Cordoba, in Islamic Spain, became a beacon of coexistence and knowledge. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of books. Its streets were lit by oil lamps. Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived, not always peacefully, but often productively, side by side. Meanwhile, in northern Europe, a different power was rising, rougher, colder, but no less ambitious. The Franks, a Germanic people who had once been Rome's enemies, now claimed Christian legitimacy. Under Charlemagne, king of the Franks, a great empire was forged across what is now France, Germany, and northern Italy. In the year 800, on Christmas Day, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor in Rome, a symbolic attempt to revive the Western Empire in Christian form. Charlemagne encouraged learning, law, and liturgy. He established palace schools and invited scholars from across Europe, including the English monk Alcuin of York, to lead educational reform. Though his empire fragmented after his death, it laid the groundwork for what would become medieval Christendom, a vast, loosely unified world bound by faith more than flag. Yet medieval life was not centered in courts or monasteries alone. It lived in the village, the field, the forge, the forest. Most people were peasants, farmers who worked land owned by lords. Society was organized by the feudal system, a hierarchy of obligation and protection. A king granted land to nobles. Nobles protected the king and managed knights. Knights served in war and guarded peasants, who in turn gave labor and harvest in exchange for safety. It was a world of seasons and cycles: spring planting, summer toil, autumn harvest, winter fasting. The church calendar structured the year: Advent, Lent, Easter, Pentecost. Life was hard, but predictable. For many, the hope of heaven gave meaning to suffering on earth. And yet, beyond the fields, the world was shifting. To the east, the ancient Byzantine Empire, the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, still stood. Centered in the shining city of Constantinople, it was a bastion of wealth, art, and Orthodox Christianity. Its mosaics glittered with gold. Its scholars preserved classical texts in Greek. Its emperor ruled as God's regent on earth. But Constantinople faced growing pressure from all sides, from Slavic tribes in the north, Persians and Arabs in the east, and eventually the rising power of the Seljuk Turks. This tension between East and West, between Christian kingdoms and Islamic empires, would erupt violently in the form of the Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II, responding to a call for aid from the Byzantine emperor, preached a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. Tens of thousands of knights, nobles, and peasants took the cross, setting out for the Holy Land. The First Crusade succeeded in capturing Jerusalem in 1099. But the victory was short-lived. Over the next 2 centuries, 8 major crusades were launched, along with smaller campaigns. Some were aimed at the Holy Land, others turned inward, against heretics, pagans, even fellow Christians. One crusade ended in the sacking of Constantinople itself. The Crusades were as much about power, wealth, and politics as they were about faith. They brought horror, but also exchange, of ideas, spices, medicine, and technology. From the Islamic world, Europeans re-encountered classical philosophy, algebra, optics, and new agricultural techniques. These seeds would later blossom into the Renaissance. To the north, a different kind of warrior had emerged: the Vikings. From the icy fjords of Scandinavia, Norse seafarers began raiding coasts, rivers, and monasteries around 800 CE. Their longships, fast and shallow-bottomed, could navigate both oceans and inland rivers. They attacked monasteries in Lindisfarne, settled Iceland and Greenland, and briefly reached the shores of Vinland, likely in modern-day Newfoundland, 5 centuries before Columbus. But the Vikings were more than raiders. They were traders, settlers, and storytellers. In time, they founded kingdoms in Normandy, Kievan Rus, and Dublin. Their sagas, rich in mythology and memory, preserved a unique view of gods, fate, and honor. As the medieval world matured, learning slowly returned. Universities were founded in Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and Salamanca, centers of theology, law, and logic. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas attempted to reconcile reason and faith. Scholasticism, the dominant method of inquiry, sought answers through careful debate, drawing upon Aristotle and Augustine alike. Architecture soared. The Gothic cathedrals of Europe, Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, rose like forests of stone and glass. Their stained windows told stories in color. Their arches reached toward heaven. Built over generations, they were the work of entire communities, of masons, carvers, architects, and believers. But not all was rising. In the 14th century, the medieval world faced catastrophe. In 1347, a ship arrived in Sicily carrying rats infected with Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague. Over the next 5 years, the Black Death swept across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, killing as much as a third, or even half, of the population in some regions. Whole villages were emptied, fields went unplanted, mass graves were dug, faith was tested. Flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves in penance. Others blamed outsiders, scapegoating Jews and foreigners. Yet paradoxically, the plague also created space for change, weakening the old order, raising wages and sowing seeds of renewal. By the late 1300s, the medieval world was not ending, but transforming. Gunpowder was changing warfare. Paper and vernacular language were reshaping communication. Trade routes stretched farther, from the Silk Road to the spice ports of the Indian Ocean. Kingdoms consolidated, monarchs grew stronger. The church faced challenges, schisms, reformers, and questions it could not easily answer. The world was shifting again, toward renaissance, discovery, and revolution. But before those came, there was the long medieval age, a time of monks and knights, of cathedrals and crusades, of candles flickering in quiet scriptoria, and choirs singing beneath vaulted stone. A time when empires rose not only through conquest, but through belief. And when, in the wake of Rome, humanity did not vanish, but turned its face upward, toward God, toward salvation, and toward meaning, in the shadow of the eternal. The Dynasties of the East. Far across the mountains and steppes, beyond deserts and winding rivers, a vast and ancient civilization was rising and falling in long, rhythmic breaths. In the east, where the sun first touches the land, where mountains pierce the clouds and bamboo forests sway in mist, the story of imperial China unfolded over thousands of years. A story of dynasties and dreams, of emperors and philosophers, of paper, porcelain, and silk flowing like rivers through the veins of an empire. The land that would become China was first bound not by borders, but by rivers, the Huanghe, or Yellow River, in the north, and the Yangtze River in the south. These waterways nourished the soil, carried crops, and shaped the early settlements that would become the foundation of one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations. After the Bronze Age legacy of the Shang dynasty, which had left behind oracle bones and bronze ritual vessels, a new power rose in the heartland of the Yellow River Valley, the Zhou dynasty, beginning around 1046 BCE. The Zhou would rule for over 800 years, the longest dynasty in Chinese history. But its power would not remain whole. In time, the Zhou kings became ceremonial figures, as local warlords, feudal lords known as Zhuhu, carved up the realm. Their ambition, combined with military innovation and political intrigue, led to an era of profound conflict known as the Warring States period. It was an age of chaos, but also of unparalleled philosophical growth. In these turbulent centuries, thinkers and sages sought to make sense of disorder. Their words would shape not only China, but the world. Confucius, born in 551 BCE, taught of duty, virtue, and harmony. He envisioned a society where rulers ruled by moral example, not by fear, where sons respected fathers and subjects honored their leaders as if they were family. His sayings, compiled in the Analects, would become the backbone of Chinese education, governance, and ethics for generations. At the same time, Laozi, the legendary founder of Taoism, offered a gentler path, one of yielding, silence, and flow. The Tao Te Ching, his mystical poem, speaks of Wu Wei, effortless action, and the way of nature. To live in harmony with the Tao, the way, was to find peace not in control, but in surrender. Other schools emerged: legalism, which emphasized strict laws and harsh punishments; Mohism, which advocated universal love and meritocracy; yin-yang cosmology, which saw balance in all things, dark and light, male and female, motion and stillness. And from this crucible of thought, a new empire emerged. In 221 BCE, the Qin dynasty, under the ruthless and visionary Qin Shi Huang, unified China for the first time. He abolished feudalism, standardized weights, measures, currency, and even the width of cart axles. He ordered the construction of vast roads and canals, and began the first version of the Great Wall, connecting older fortifications to keep northern nomads at bay. But his reign, though transformative, was harsh. Books were burned, scholars executed, dissent crushed. He sought immortality, but died young, entombed in a vast mausoleum guarded by the now famous Terracotta Army, thousands of life-sized soldiers, each unique, standing watch beneath the earth. The Qin collapsed soon after his death, but the idea of a unified China remained. From the ashes rose the Han Dynasty, founded in 206 BCE by Liu Bang, a former peasant who became Emperor Gaozu. The Han would rule for over 4 centuries and establish patterns of governance, culture, and identity that would define China for millennia. Under the Han, Confucianism became the state philosophy. An imperial civil service was established, where officials were selected not by birthright, but by examinations, testing their knowledge of Confucian texts, poetry, and law. It was the world's first meritocratic bureaucracy. The Han also expanded China's frontiers, pushing west into Central Asia, south into Vietnam, and north into the steppe. These conquests opened the way for a new and glittering artery of exchange, the Silk Road. Silk, soft, shimmering, and precious, became one of the most desired commodities in the ancient world. Caravans carried bolts of it across deserts and mountains, trading with Persians, Indians, and Romans. In return came glassware, spices, gemstones, and ideas. Buddhism, born in India, traveled this road as well, arriving in China by the 1st century CE. Though foreign, its message of suffering, compassion, and transcendence found fertile ground, especially as the Han began to decline. After the fall of the Han in 220 CE, China entered another period of division, an age of competing kingdoms, nomadic invasions, and cultural blending. Yet even in fragmentation, new brilliance arose. Buddhism spread widely, evolving into uniquely Chinese forms like Chan, later known in Japan as Zen. Monasteries multiplied, becoming centers of learning, charity, and art. Cave temples like those at Dunhuang and Longmen were carved into cliffs, their walls covered in frescoes and thousands of statues of the Buddha, serene and eternal. In 618 CE, a new dynasty unified China again, the Tang Dynasty, often called a golden age of cosmopolitan culture. The Tang capital, Chang'an, became the largest city in the world. With its wide avenues, bustling markets, and foreign quarters, it was a truly international metropolis. Merchants, monks, envoys, and poets walked its streets. Goods from India, Persia, Arabia, and Central Asia flowed into its gates. Music, dance, clothing, and food blended from dozens of cultures. This was a time of high art and refined taste. Poetry reached sublime heights under masters like Li Bai, whose verses danced with moonlight and wine, and Du Fu, whose lines captured both personal sorrow and the pain of war. The Tang court patronized painters, sculptors, and calligraphers. Buddhist imagery flourished, but so too did Taoist landscapes and Confucian portraits. It was an age of elegance and power. Yet no dynasty lasts forever. The Tang declined amid rebellion and corruption. In the aftermath, the Song dynasty emerged in 960 CE, ushering in an era of technological and economic transformation. The Song were not conquerors. They often struggled against northern invaders. But in culture, science, and invention, they excelled beyond measure. Under the Song, printing flourished. Movable type was invented in China centuries before Gutenberg. Books became more affordable and literacy expanded. The compass was refined, improving navigation. Gunpowder, discovered earlier, began to be used in warfare, first in fireworks and bombs, later in rockets and cannons. Paper money was introduced. Markets boomed. Cities swelled. The population of China during the Song may have exceeded 100 million, by far the largest in the world at the time. Agriculture advanced, with new rice strains and irrigation techniques. Trade flowed along canals, especially the Grand Canal, linking north and south, grain and silk, cities and farms. In art, the Song prized subtlety. Landscapes painted in ink depicted misty mountains, lonely scholars and drifting boats. Not for decoration, but for contemplation. These paintings were philosophy in form, expressions of harmony between humanity and nature. Yet even the brilliance of the Song could not withstand the tide of history. In the 13th century, the Mongols swept down from the steppes. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, they created the largest contiguous land empire in world history. After decades of warfare, the Mongols conquered all of China and established the Yuan dynasty in 1271 under Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson. Kublai moved the capital to what is now Beijing and sought to rule as a Chinese emperor, not just a Mongol Khan. The Yuan dynasty maintained order and promoted trade, especially along the revived Silk Road. It was during this time that a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo traveled to the Mongol court and later wrote of cities paved with gold, grand postal systems, and bustling markets beyond anything he had imagined in Europe. Though the Mongols had embraced Chinese culture, resentment lingered. In 1368, rebellion broke out, and the Ming dynasty was born. The Ming restored native rule and Confucian tradition. They rebuilt the Great Wall. They organized the empire into tightly run provinces. And in the early 15th century, they sent massive fleets across the seas under Admiral Zheng He, towering ships that reached Southeast Asia, India, and the coast of Africa. These voyages were not about conquest, but about prestige, demonstrating the grandeur of the Middle Kingdom to the wider world. Eventually, the voyages ended. The fleets were dismantled. The focus turned inward. And yet, the legacy of the dynasties remained. Each had risen and fallen in turn. The Zhou, Qin, Han, Tang, Song, Yuan, and Ming. And yet the thread of China endured. Not as a single empire, but as a civilization. Continuous, adaptable, and profoundly deep. It had given the world not only inventions and goods, but philosophies of life. Ways of seeing time, nature, community, and virtue. From the winding Great Wall to the quiet hush of a tea ceremony. From the thunder of cavalry on the steppes to the brushstroke of a poem on silk. The dynasties of the East were never just about power. They were about balance, continuity, and the quiet strength of tradition flowing like a river through time. Kings, castles, and the Crusades. In the cold, damp mornings of medieval Europe, as mist hung low over meadows and bells echoed from distant chapels, life unfolded within a world built on hierarchy, oaths, and stone. a world where the silhouette of a castle loomed above the countryside, where armored knights rode beneath fluttering banners, and where the name of a king might hold sway over hundreds of thousands, though many would never see his face. This was the age of kings and castles, of crusaders and clerics, of tournaments, toll roads, and torchlit feasts. It was a time of deep loyalty and deep fear, of firm belief in divine order, and of a society shaped by birth as much as by courage. After the fall of the Roman Empire, much of Europe splintered into a mosaic of competing kingdoms, principalities, and tribal territories. In place of emperors came kings, men who claimed divine right to rule, though their actual control often depended on the strength of their alliances and the loyalty of their vassals. These kings ruled not from palaces of marble, but from strongholds of stone, castles perched on hills, surrounded by walls, moats, and drawbridges. At first, castles were built of wood, quick to construct but easy to burn. But by the 11th century, stone became the standard. Massive keeps rose skyward, their thick walls designed to withstand siege engines, arrows, and time itself. The castle was not just a fortress. It was the center of life for the surrounding lands, a symbol of protection and power. Inside its walls lived the lord and his family, often surrounded by soldiers, servants, scribes, and sometimes a chaplain. Kitchens bustled, smiths hammered iron into horseshoes and swords, and minstrels strummed lutes beside hearthfires. Below the castle, the manor stretched across fields and farms. It was worked by peasants, some free, others bound by law as serfs, who owed labor and taxes to the lord in exchange for land and protection. Their lives were marked by seasons and sacraments. They planted barley in spring, harvested in autumn, and celebrated feast days with dances and bread. Society was structured by the feudal system, a pyramid of obligations. At the top stood the king. Beneath him, powerful nobles held land in exchange for military service. These nobles had vassals of their own, often knights, who pledged loyalty and fought in return for land or income. At the bottom were the peasants, whose toil sustained it all. Yet even kings were not free to do as they pleased. They were expected to rule justly, to protect the realm, and to honor the church. Monarchs were crowned not just by ceremony, but by sacrament, anointed with holy oils, confirmed by bishops, and reminded that their authority came not from ambition, but from God. Some kings ruled wisely: Alfred the Great in England, Philip Augustus in France, Stephen I in Hungary. Others were reckless or cruel, their reigns marked by war, famine, or civil strife. And still others were more legend than history, like King Arthur, whose imagined court at Camelot symbolized chivalry, justice, and the elusive quest for the Holy Grail. Knighthood was the idealized embodiment of this world, a fusion of warrior, gentleman, and servant of Christ. Boys born into noble families began training as pages, then squires, learning to ride, hunt, and wield a sword. By their early 20s, they might be knighted in a solemn ceremony, receiving a sword, a blow to the shoulder, and an oath to uphold chivalry, to defend the weak, to protect the church, to show mercy, and to fight with honor. In practice, knights could be ruthless, but the code endured, in poetry, in legend, and in the elaborate rituals of tournaments, where knights jousted before crowds, their lances splintering as they charged on thundering horses clad in armor and heraldic crests. Yet no force shaped medieval Europe more profoundly than the Church. The Catholic Church, headquartered in Rome, was more than a religion. It was a unifying institution in a divided world, administering sacraments, collecting tithes, enforcing moral law, and mediating disputes between kings. Bishops held land. Abbots advised rulers. Monasteries produced books, brewed ale, and provided aid to the sick and poor. Monastic orders, like the Benedictines, the Cistercians, and later the Franciscans and Dominicans, offered lives of discipline and prayer. Some monks became scholars, others became missionaries, venturing into pagan lands to preach and convert. In cathedrals, the faithful knelt before flickering candles. Bells called them to mass. Saints were venerated. Relics were treasured. Bones, cloth, or wood believed to hold divine power. Pilgrimages became popular. Journeys to Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem. Acts of devotion and penance that spanned continents. It was from this deeply religious world that the Crusades were born. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd and called upon Christian knights to take up arms. He spoke of atrocities in the East, of sacred places defiled, and of a holy duty to reclaim Jerusalem, the city of Christ, from Muslim rule. The response was overwhelming. Thousands answered the call, nobles and knights, but also peasants, merchants, even children. They sewed crosses to their tunics and marched east in what became known as the First Crusade. Against odds, they reached Jerusalem in 1099 and captured it in a bloody siege. For nearly a century, Crusader states were carved from the Levant. Christian outposts like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Tripoli, and Antioch. They were defended by orders such as the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, warrior monks sworn to poverty and obedience, yet fearsome in battle. But the Muslim world did not remain divided. Under leaders like Nur ad-Din and later Saladin, Muslim forces began to reconquer lost territory. In 1187, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, not in vengeance, but with clemency, allowing many inhabitants to live. More crusades followed, the second, the third, the fourth, and beyond. Some achieved temporary victories, others failed. One diverted entirely, sacking the Christian city of Constantinople in 1204, deepening the rift between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. There were northern crusades against pagans in the Baltic, Albigensian crusades in France against heretical Christians, even a tragic children's crusade where thousands of young believers set out for the Holy Land, many of them never returning. The Crusades were a crucible of contradiction, piety and violence, courage and cruelty. They brought immense suffering, but also cultural exchange. Crusaders encountered new foods, technologies, and ideas. From the Islamic world came sugar, citrus, algebra, paper, and classical texts long forgotten in the West. These conflicts also helped shape national identity. Kings led crusades. Nobles gained fame. Banners and coats of arms became more formalized. Languages shifted. Law codes developed. And as the Crusades waned, another force was rising in the shadows of Europe's castles. Commerce. Markets expanded. Towns grew. Guilds were formed. Associations of weavers, masons, butchers, and more, protecting trade standards and training apprentices. Fairs became seasonal events, vibrant gatherings where traders from across Europe met to exchange goods, gossip, and coin. By the 13th century, walled towns were emerging as centers of wealth and learning. Chartered cities negotiated for freedoms from feudal lords, and a new class began to rise, the burghers, or bourgeoisie, merchants and professionals whose influence would grow in the centuries ahead. Monarchs, too, were changing. Some kings consolidated power, creating law codes, tax systems, and standing armies. Others were checked by parliaments or councils. In England, the Magna Carta of 1215 forced King John to recognize limits on royal authority, a document that would echo through future democratic thought. In France, the Capetian kings laid foundations for a centralized state. In Spain, Christian kingdoms gradually pushed south in the Reconquista, reclaiming land from Muslim rulers over the course of centuries. And in the Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of duchies and cities jostled beneath an emperor's shifting authority. Yet even amid change, the castle remained, enduring, immovable, and iconic. High on its hill, with banners rippling in the wind, its gatehouse guarded by portcullis and boiling oil, it stood not only as a military fortress, but as a symbol of the medieval world, layered, fortified, and built to endure siege. But time, like a siege, is relentless. Gunpowder would soon render castles obsolete. Trade would shift power from land to coin, and knowledge, copied in quiet monasteries and carried from distant lands, would soon spark a new light. For now, though, the world was still medieval, bound by oath and altar, lit by firelight and faith, and watched over by towers of stone that rose like the bones of giants above the rolling hills of Europe. Renaissance and Rebirth. There are moments in history when the world seems to awaken, as though it stretches out of a long sleep, blinks into the light, and sees itself anew. In Europe, after centuries of castles and crusades, a change was stirring, not with the thunder of war or the rise of new empires, but in brushstrokes, in pages, in stars plotted in the sky. A whisper, then a ripple, then a wave. A cultural rebirth that would echo for centuries. This was the Renaissance, a word that means rebirth in French, though it began in the sun-drenched cities of Italy. And what it sought to revive was not lost faith or forgotten kingdoms, but the spirit of classical antiquity, the ideas of ancient Greece and Rome, buried beneath the dust of time and the soot of medieval warfare. The Renaissance was not a single event, nor even a single century. It was a movement of mind, stretching roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, growing slowly, then spreading rapidly across Europe, transforming art, science, politics, philosophy, and the very nature of knowledge. It began, fittingly, in Florence, a city of narrow streets, rich merchants, and restless ambition. Here, wealth from banking and wool trade funded not only cathedrals, but curiosity. At the heart of this new world was a growing belief in human potential, a sense that mankind was not merely a sinful creature waiting for salvation, but a wondrous, capable being, able to observe, create, and understand the universe. This philosophy came to be known as humanism. Humanism was not a rejection of faith, but a widening of perspective. It encouraged the study of history, literature, ethics, and rhetoric, the subjects the ancients had valued. To read Cicero, to debate as Socrates had, to sculpt as Phidias did, this was seen not as pride, but as honoring the full gift of human reason and imagination. Art became a mirror of this new spirit. In earlier centuries, religious art had often been symbolic, stylized, otherworldly. But the artists of the Renaissance sought realism, emotion, and the beauty of the natural world. One of the first to break from tradition was Giotto, whose frescoes brought volume and human expression to sacred scenes. His figures stood on solid ground, their faces full of feeling. It was a quiet revolution. Then came Masaccio, who mastered perspective, using vanishing points to give depth to his paintings. Then Botticelli, whose Birth of Venus blended myth with elegance, draping pagan beauty in luminous color. And then came giants. Leonardo da Vinci, born in 1452, was not just a painter, but an inventor, anatomist, architect, and dreamer. He kept notebooks filled with flying machines, anatomical sketches, and engineering marvels. He painted the Mona Lisa, her smile elusive and eternal, and the Last Supper, with apostles frozen in a moment of divine drama. Michelangelo Buonarroti, sculptor and painter, carved the David from a single block of marble, a vision of youthful strength and resolve. He painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling, lying on his back for years, bringing Genesis to life in swirls of muscle and movement. Raphael, younger and gentler, painted harmony itself, In the school of Athens, he gathered the great minds of antiquity beneath soaring arches, placing Plato and Aristotle in conversation, surrounded by the future and past. Architecture, too, transformed. In Rome, Filippo Brunelleschi engineered the massive dome of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, a feat of mathematics and ingenuity that defied Gothic heaviness and embraced classical grace. Columns, domes, and symmetry returned to European skylines. But the Renaissance was not only in marble and paint, it also lived in books, and with it, knowledge spread like never before. In the mid-15th century, a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press. Though woodblock printing had existed in Asia for centuries, Gutenberg's press made the mass production of texts in Europe possible for the first time. The Gutenberg Bible, printed around 1455, was a masterpiece. But more than that, it was a gateway. Suddenly, books were not just for monks and nobles. They became accessible to merchants, students, and artisans. Ideas no longer had to travel by word of mouth or manuscript copied by candlelight. Now they could be printed, duplicated, and carried from city to city in days. Literacy increased, universities multiplied, pamphlets, essays, maps, and treatises flowed across borders. Knowledge began to accelerate. Among the most revolutionary of these ideas were those in science. For centuries, European understanding of the cosmos had been guided by the teachings of Aristotle and Ptolemy, a geocentric universe, with Earth unmoving at the center and the heavens in perfect, nested spheres. But in 1543, the Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus published De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the celestial spheres. In it, he proposed a heliocentric model, the Sun, not Earth, at the center. It was a radical shift, one that would take generations to be accepted. Later, Galileo Galilei, with his telescope, would confirm the moons of Jupiter and the phases of Venus. He would write not in Latin, but in Italian for the common reader. He faced the Inquisition for his beliefs, forced to recant, but the cosmos had already begun to expand. Exploration, too, reshaped the world. In the late 15th century, mariners from Portugal and Spain set out beyond familiar waters. Prince Henry the Navigator encouraged voyages down the coast of Africa. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, seeking a western route to Asia, crossed the Atlantic and reached the Caribbean, unknowingly opening a door between two hemispheres. Soon, Vasco da Gama reached India. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition circumnavigated the globe. The oceans, once barriers, became bridges. But these discoveries also brought conquest. In the Americas, the Aztec and Inca empires were overwhelmed by steel, disease, and empire. Gold and silver flowed into Europe. So did sugar, tobacco, and potatoes. And from Europe came settlers, missionaries, and soldiers, forever altering the lives of millions across continents. The Renaissance was not only beautiful, it was also violent, ambitious, and deeply flawed. Yet in its essence, it was about possibility, the belief that the world could be known, that the human spirit could reach beyond the bounds of dogma, and that greatness lay not only in heaven, but here on earth. Literature flourished. In England, William Shakespeare wrote plays that plumbed the depths of ambition, love, jealousy, and fate. In France, Montaigne pondered the nature of the self in his essays. In Italy, Machiavelli examined power and pragmatism in The Prince. Women, often excluded, still found voice. Christine de Pizan, writing in defense of female intellect. Isabella d'Este, a patron of the arts. Artemisia Gentileschi, a painter of drama and defiance. Music changed, too. Composers like Josquin des Prez and Palestrina created sacred works of haunting harmony. Polyphony, the weaving of independent melodies, became the signature of the Renaissance era. And in this time, death was not forgotten. Plague still visited cities. Wars still raged. Yet the response was not despair, but creation. To paint, to write, to build, to leave behind something lasting. By the early 17th century, the Renaissance began to give way to new eras of Reformation, scientific revolution, Enlightenment. But its pulse continued. In architecture, in libraries, in every printed book. Its legacy was not a return to the ancient world, but the forging of a bridge, from medieval to modern, from faith to reason, from silence to song. And across that bridge, the world walked, step by step, into the future. Revolutions and Enlightenment. In the quiet salons of Paris, in flickering candlelight, voices once whispered ideas that would soon shake empires. In ink-stained studies, thinkers wrote through the night, pondering liberty, reason, and the very nature of existence. And far across oceans, crowds gathered in streets and town squares, calling for change not in the name of kings or gods, but of the people. This was an age of questioning, of revolutions, both of mind and of nation. The Enlightenment, as it came to be called, was not a single moment, nor confined to a single land. It was a profound shift in the way people thought about the world and their place in it. A movement toward reason, skepticism, and the belief that human beings, not divine decree, could shape their own destiny. Its roots lay deep in the soil, tilled by the Renaissance, and watered by the discoveries of the scientific revolution. But now, these ideas moved from laboratories and libraries into public life, into law courts, governments, newspapers, and cafes. To live in the Enlightenment was to ask, what is truth, what is justice, and who has the right to rule? The thinkers of the time, often called philosophes, believed in the power of reason, that through observation, logic, and dialogue, humans could improve society, just as they had improved their understanding of nature. In England, the political philosopher John Locke argued that all people were born with certain natural rights, to life, liberty, and property. Government, he claimed, was not divine, but a social contract, an agreement among free individuals to protect their rights. If rulers failed in this duty, the people had not just the right, but the duty to change them. In France, Voltaire, sharp-tongued and fearless, wrote of tolerance and civil liberties. He mocked religious fanaticism, criticized tyranny, and championed free speech. "I do not agree with what you say," he wrote, "but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Montesquieu, another French thinker, studied governments across the world and proposed the idea of separation of powers, that authority should not rest in one body, but be divided among branches to guard against abuse. And Rousseau, passionate and idealistic, spoke of the general will, the collective good that should guide a just society. He believed that civilization had corrupted man's natural innocence, and only through equality and direct democracy could people reclaim their freedom. These ideas took hold not only among philosophers and elites, but among printers, artisans, students, and merchants. The printing press, now widespread, became a tool of revolution. Pamphlets, essays, and treatises were copied and smuggled across borders. Enlightenment ideals seeped into coffee houses, drawing rooms, and marketplaces. At the same time, scientific knowledge continued to advance. Isaac Newton, building on the work of earlier astronomers, described the laws of motion and universal gravitation, revealing a cosmos governed not by mystery but by mathematics. The universe, it seemed, followed elegant rules, discoverable by the human mind. In medicine, anatomy was mapped more precisely. In chemistry, elements were catalogued. In biology, the classification of species began. Telescopes turned toward distant planets. Microscopes revealed the tiny world within a drop of water. The Enlightenment was not anti-religion. Many of its thinkers were deeply spiritual, but it was skeptical of dogma, especially when used to justify power or suppress dissent. And soon, this intellectual upheaval would lead to political ones. The first great fire of revolution ignited across the Atlantic. In the American colonies, resentment had grown for years. Settlers, many of whom had fled monarchy and oppression in Europe, bristled at the taxes, restrictions, and distant rule imposed by the British Crown. In 1776, representatives from the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia and signed the Declaration of Independence. Penned largely by Thomas Jefferson, it echoed the Enlightenment's heartbeat. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The American Revolution was not just a war of muskets and militias, but of ideas. Farmers, lawyers, and blacksmiths rose against one of the world's greatest empires, fighting not for conquest, but for self-governance. After 8 years of struggle, the colonies triumphed. In 1789, they ratified a constitution that enshrined Enlightenment principles, a republic with checks and balances, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and a government by the people. The world watched. And in France, the powder keg was ready. In the late 18th century, France was a nation of staggering inequality. The first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, the nobility, held wealth and power, while the third estate, the common people, bore the burdens of taxation, hunger, and hardship. Bread grew scarce, debt mounted, Enlightenment ideas swirled. And in 1789, the storm broke. The French Revolution began with calls for reform and quickly turned into a full reimagining of society. The Bastille, a prison and symbol of royal tyranny, was stormed by a crowd on July 14th, a moment that became the revolution's icon. Soon after, the National Assembly abolished feudal privileges and declared the rights of man and of the citizen, liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Monarchy was no longer sacred. In 1793, King Louis XVI was tried and executed by guillotine, followed soon after by Queen Marie Antoinette. The revolution had become irreversible. What followed was a time of both hope and terror. Revolutionary leaders vied for control. Laws changed rapidly. The calendar was remade, churches were shuttered, and in the name of liberty, thousands were executed in the Reign of Terror, a period marked by purges and paranoia. Yet even in this turmoil, the seeds of modern democracy took root. The revolution dismantled hereditary privilege. It challenged the idea that rulers were chosen by God. It introduced the concept of citizenship, not just subjects. And it inspired uprisings and reform across Europe and beyond. In time, the chaos gave way to new order, first under a revolutionary government, then under a remarkable figure who would leave his own towering mark on history: Napoleon Bonaparte. A military genius, Napoleon rose rapidly, declaring himself Emperor of the French in 1804. He codified laws, restructured the economy, and conquered much of Europe. Though he ruled with iron authority, he spread many ideals of the revolution: meritocracy, secular governance, and legal equality, to lands long trapped in feudalism. His wars reshaped the continent, but his defeat at Waterloo in 1815 ended the Napoleonic era. Still, the world had changed. The Enlightenment and its revolutions had redrawn the map, not just of land, but of thought. Power was no longer seen as the sole right of monarchs. Education was no longer reserved for the elite. Law and science had become tools of liberation, not only control. Other nations began to stir. In Haiti, enslaved Africans led the first successful slave revolt, establishing the first Black Republic in 1804. Across Latin America, revolutionary leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martin fought for independence from Spanish rule. Even in Europe, the old monarchies felt the tremors. Some reasserted control, others reformed, but none could entirely silence the Enlightenment's call. In homes and halls, in schools and courts, the questions remained. What is justice? Who deserves freedom? And how shall we live together? As the 19th century dawned, the answers were still uncertain. But the voices of the Enlightenment, the pens of Locke and Rousseau, the speeches of Jefferson and Robespierre, the visions of equality and dignity, continued to echo. A world of kingdoms had become a world of nations. A world of subjects had begun to dream of citizens, and the age of revolution had only just begun. Empires, industry, and the modern age. The world had revolved on its axis for millennia, but now, in the space of just a few generations, it began to spin faster. Steam hissed from iron engines, factory whistles pierced the morning fog, railways coiled like metal serpents across continents, cities swelled with brick and soot, and across distant lands, flags were planted in foreign soil. This was the modern age, the 19th and early 20th centuries, a time when human civilization transformed at a staggering pace. Old empires stretched their limbs across the globe, new ideas challenged ancient orders, and the rhythms of daily life were rewritten by industry. The change began with machines. In the late 18th century, innovations in agriculture and textile production had sparked what would become known as the Industrial Revolution. First in Britain, then across Europe, North America, and eventually the world. At the heart of it was coal, black rock pulled from deep mines, burned to produce steam that powered engines. These engines drove looms in textile mills, pumped water from mines, and spun the wheels of locomotives. No longer tied to wind, water, or muscle, production could now happen anywhere, at any scale. Factories rose by rivers and railways. Manchester, once a modest town, became a pulsing industrial hub. Birmingham, Glasgow, Liverpool, all grew rapidly, transformed by steel, cotton, and trade. In the countryside, artisans and farmers watched as machines replaced the old ways. A weaver who once worked at home by firelight might now toil beside roaring machines, their rhythm relentless, the hours long. The factory was a new universe, loud, impersonal, and often cruel. Men, women, and even children worked 12 or 14-hour shifts. Accidents were common, wages were low, the air was thick with smoke, the floors slick with oil. Yet industry brought unprecedented growth. Trains linked cities that had once been days apart. Steamships crossed oceans. Telegraph lines carried messages across continents in moments. Goods flowed from ports in crates and barrels, manufactured in one hemisphere, consumed in another. And behind this surge was a new idea: capitalism. The belief in private ownership, free markets, and profit-driven enterprise. Some grew fantastically wealthy. Entrepreneurs like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and Isambard Kingdom Brunel became titans of industry, symbols of both ambition and inequality. With wealth came reform, but also resistance. In Britain, the Luddites smashed machines in protest, fearful of lost livelihoods. Trade unions began to form, workers joining together to demand safer conditions, shorter hours, and better pay. Over time, strikes, protests, and political pressure brought real change. Labor laws, child protections, and eventually the 8-hour workday. As factories multiplied, so did cities. Urbanization accelerated. People poured in from the countryside seeking work. Row houses, tenements, and slums sprang up to house the masses. Sanitation struggled to keep pace. Disease, overcrowding, and poverty plagued the working class. Yet even amid hardship, the cities buzzed with energy. Gas lamps lit the streets. Public libraries opened. Music halls and coffee houses became places of gathering. Education expanded. Newspapers flourished. A new middle class, teachers, clerks, managers, began to emerge, reshaping culture and politics. And behind the scenes, science and technology advanced further. Electricity replaced gas. Edison brought the light bulb, Tesla the alternating current. Bell transmitted the human voice over wires. Pasteur discovered germs and sterilization. Darwin proposed evolution by natural selection, challenging humanity's understanding of its place in nature. In medicine, anesthesia transformed surgery. Vaccines prevented illness. Public health measures reduced epidemics. Lifespans lengthened. Cities, once death traps, became homes to millions. And all around, empires expanded. Fueled by industry's hunger for raw materials and markets, the great powers of Europe carved up the globe. Britain, with its vast navy and industrial might, became the most expansive empire in history, ruling over India, parts of Africa, the Caribbean, Australia, and beyond. France seized Algeria and Indochina. Belgium took the Congo. Germany, Italy, Portugal, and others joined the race. Even the United States, once a colony, now reached outward, across the Pacific to Hawaii and the Philippines, and southward into Latin America. The age of imperialism had arrived. Colonies provided cotton, rubber, coffee, tea, tin, gold, and labor, often under brutal conditions. In return, they received European governance, railways, and schools, but also dispossession, forced conversions, and cultural erasure. In India, railroads and English language education expanded, but so did famine and resistance. In Africa, arbitrary borders were drawn with no regard for ethnic or tribal realities, laying seeds for future conflict. In China, Western powers demanded trade concessions, sparking humiliation and rebellion, including the Opium Wars and the Boxer Uprising. Imperialism was justified by ideas of superiority, racial theories, civilizing missions, and the spread of Christianity. But in every colony, resistance simmered. Leaders emerged. Gandhi in India, Shaka Zulu in southern Africa. Intellectuals, poets, and revolutionaries began to imagine new futures. Meanwhile, back in Europe, nations became the dominant identity. Where once loyalty was owed to a king or lord, now it was claimed by a people, sharing language, history, and culture. Nationalism surged. Germany and Italy, long fractured, were unified. Flags, anthems, and schools promoted national pride. But nationalism had a darker side. It turned neighbors into rivals. It fueled arms races, military alliances, and colonial competition. It exalted us and distrusted them. And as the 20th century approached, Europe, rich, proud, and deeply entangled, stood like a forest of dry tinder, waiting for a spark. Even so, hope endured. Art, music, and literature flourished. Romanticism gave way to realism, then to impressionism, as painters captured light and feeling in new ways. Composers like Beethoven, Chopin, and Debussy stirred hearts across concert halls. Writers like Dickens, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky chronicled the struggles of the age with deep empathy. Women began to organize, demanding the right to vote, to own property, to work and learn freely. The suffrage movement spread from Britain to the United States to New Zealand. Progress was slow but irreversible. The modern world had arrived. Faster, louder, more connected than ever before. Steamships crossed the Atlantic in days. Telegraphs spanned continents. Massive world fairs in cities like London, Paris, and Chicago celebrated progress, invention, and imperial grandeur. Visitors gazed at electric lights, moving pictures, and mechanical marvels, glimpses of the world to come. And yet, beneath the pride, there was also tension. Workers still labored in poor conditions. Colonized peoples lived under foreign rule. Nations eyed each other warily, and a generation born into factories and cities now looked forward not with certainty, but with anxiety. The engines of industry had remade the world, but whether they were driving toward a golden future or toward the brink of catastrophe remained to be seen. War, innovation, and the digital world. The 20th century dawned with unmatched optimism. Steel skeletons lifted cities into the sky. Automobiles rumbled along dusty roads. Telephones bridged vast distances. And in laboratories and universities, minds stretched outward toward the stars and inward toward the atom. It was a world connected, inventive, and full of promise. But it was also fragile. In 1914, a single bullet in Sarajevo shattered the illusion of stability. A young assassin, driven by nationalism, pulled the trigger that ended the life of an archduke, and in its wake ignited a war unlike any the world had known. The conflict that followed, known simply as the Great War, dragged nations into chaos. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire on one side, France, Britain, Russia, and later the United States on the other. Soldiers crossed oceans to fight in muddy trenches that stretched from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. Life in those trenches was brutal, filled with rats, disease, gas attacks, and the constant drumbeat of artillery. Men lived and died for inches of ground. The very earth became a graveyard. This war introduced machine guns, poison gas, airplanes, and tanks, tools that mechanized death on an industrial scale. Battles like the Somme, Verdun, and Ypres claimed hundreds of thousands of lives in weeks. Civilians, too, suffered through blockades, hunger, and bombardment. When it ended in 1918, more than 16 million people were dead. Entire empires had collapsed. The Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, the German, and the Russian. New nations were drawn on old maps, often by foreign hands. The Treaty of Versailles redrew borders, imposed heavy penalties, and planted seeds of resentment. And into this uncertain soil, new ideologies began to grow. In Russia, a revolution in 1917 overthrew the centuries-old Tsarist regime. Led by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks established the world's first communist state, the Soviet Union. They envisioned a classless society, owned by the workers, governed by the people. But what followed was a state marked by control, repression, and forced change on an immense scale. In Italy and later Germany, anger and fear paved the way for authoritarian leaders. In 1933, Adolf Hitler, once a fringe political agitator, became Chancellor of Germany. He promised revival, unity, and vengeance. But beneath his rhetoric lay a dark ideology, one that blamed Jews, communists, and minorities for the nation's woes. The Second World War erupted in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, prompting Britain and France to declare war. What followed was a global conflagration even more devastating than the first. Cities were bombed from the sky: London, Warsaw, Dresden, Hiroshima. Troops landed on beaches in Normandy, fought in the sands of North Africa, and froze in the forests of Russia. The Holocaust, a systematic genocide, claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, along with millions of Roma, disabled people, dissidents, and others. The war ended in 1945, after 6 years of unimaginable destruction. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ushering in a terrifying new age. Over 70 million people had died. Cities lay in ruins. Borders shifted again. The old world had been swept away. In its place rose two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, each representing opposing visions for humanity's future: capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarianism. The resulting Cold War was not fought with armies, but with espionage, propaganda, proxy wars, and a nuclear arms race. Both sides built arsenals capable of destroying the planet many times over. fear of annihilation hung over the world like a shadow. Yet even in this tense standoff, innovation flourished. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. The space race had begun. In 1969, the United States responded with Apollo 11, and humanity set foot on the moon. It was a moment of awe. Fragile footprints in the lunar dust beamed across the globe. Meanwhile, nations rebuilt. Western Europe, aided by the Marshall Plan, recovered with astonishing speed. In Japan, post-war transformation turned ruin into industrial powerhouse. China, after decades of civil war, became a communist state under Mao Zedong, reshaping the lives of over 1 billion people. At home, societies began to change as well. In the United States, the civil rights movement challenged segregation and racism. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. marched, spoke, and were jailed, pushing for laws that would recognize the basic dignity of all people, regardless of color. Women, long excluded from power, organized for rights to vote, to work, to be heard. Across the world, former colonies demanded freedom. From India, where Gandhi's non-violent resistance ended British rule, to Africa, where independence movements swept the continent. The old colonial empires crumbled. New nations emerged. Flags were raised. Identities reclaimed. In the decades that followed, technology advanced rapidly. Televisions brought the world into the living room. Transistor radios crackled with music and news. Jet travel connected continents. Vaccines eradicated diseases. Computers shrank from room-sized machines to desktops, then to laptops, and finally into pockets. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, a symbol of Cold War division, was torn down by ordinary citizens. Soon after, the Soviet Union collapsed. For the first time in nearly a century, there seemed to be a single global system of trade, communication, and shared destiny. The internet, born from military research, became a public space. At first a curiosity, then a revolution. It changed how people worked, spoke, learned, and connected. Messages crossed oceans in seconds. News spread instantly. Markets opened 24 hours a day. And with it came a new form of life, digital life. In this world, identities could be anonymous or curated. Knowledge, once locked in libraries, became accessible to anyone with a signal. Social media emerged, tools that let people publish, protest, or simply share breakfast. But with this came new challenges: misinformation, surveillance, addiction, privacy concerns, echo chambers, a sense that while the world was more connected than ever, it was also more fragmented. 1 million voices, all speaking at once, rarely listening. Economically, globalization brought immense wealth, but also inequality. Jobs moved. Cities prospered while rural areas languished. The gap between rich and poor grew. Housing crises, environmental degradation, and mental health struggles surged. And as the 21st century unfolded, new threats emerged. Climate change, once theoretical, became reality. Melting glaciers, rising seas, and extreme weather events. Scientists warned of tipping points. Activists called for urgent change. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, a virus that halted the world. Borders closed. Cities fell silent. Billions stayed indoors. Economies froze. But so too did compassion shine through. Neighbors helping neighbors. Scientists working around the clock. Societies adapting in real time. The pandemic revealed both our fragility and our resilience. It reminded us how connected we are, not just by wires and trade, but by breath, touch, and the simple fact that we share this small blue planet. Now, in the present moment, we stand in a world that is still unfolding. Artificial intelligence, machines that learn, write, create. Biotechnology, editing the very code of life. space exploration, private companies reaching for Mars, debates over identity, truth, and freedom that echo in classrooms and courts, in protests and policies. We live with the knowledge of all that came before, the fire lit by early humans, the scrolls of philosophers, the revolutions of thought and blood, the great cities and fallen empires, the dreams painted on ceilings, the code that pulses through the digital ether. And always, always, the same questions return. Who are we? What kind of world do we want to build? And what legacy will we leave? The journey of humanity has been neither straight nor smooth. It has been full of wonder and horror, creation and destruction, insight and error. We have gazed at stars and drawn borders. We have written poetry and waged war. We have discovered, destroyed, and dreamed again. And still we journey on, into tomorrow, into the unknown, together. I hope you enjoyed tonight's sleep story, a slow and sweeping journey through the entire story of human history, from the first flickers of fire in the Stone Age, to the rise of cities along rivers and the building of pyramids beneath desert suns, from the quiet brilliance of ancient thinkers to the roar of revolution, the birth of machines, and the dawn of the digital world. This has been the story of us, of what we've built, believed, destroyed, discovered, and dreamed. If you're still awake, that's perfectly all right. There's no need to hold on to dates or names or facts. The story has settled into your mind like mist in a forest, quiet, gentle, present. And if you'd like to explore more, we have many other sleep stories waiting, journeys into myth, memory, and imagination, each one told softly to help carry you into deep and peaceful rest. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Wherever you are, in a quiet apartment, a small room filled with moonlight, or somewhere far away with only the hush of wind for company, I wish you stillness, safety, and the kind of sleep that heals. Sleep well.